key question that I'm going to answer today is how can we responsibly use algorithms in recruiting? And you can see that I've phrased this as a how, not can we responsibly use algorithms in recruiting, and that sort of reflects my bias. As Stella mentioned, I work for a software company, and we generate the software that helps companies write better job descriptions, and it does this in a data-driven way. And we put a lot of work into these little boxes that these little boxes that come up as you click on the text. This is a human doing this, by the way. It's not a robot. But the boxes that come up and the suggestions that it makes are done through data analysis and a lot of very conventional data science and statistical analysis. But the goal, so I'm coming here from this sort of perspective, and that's my thought process. The two questions, well, the two approaches that we use at TapRecruit and my team uses sort of merge the two worlds. And I think it's really important to go beyond data science and really understand the way in which all of this data that we're collecting on people actually translates into actions. And so how it changes what jobs they apply to, or how you interpret someone's qualifications. These are all sort of really important questions for me. And so there's a lot you can do on the data science side of things to understand, to collect all of the features associated with a job description. But sometimes there are small things that happen, or big things like pandemics that happen, that change the nature and way that people respond to certain processes or certain cues. And so understanding that connection to decision is really critical. So these are the broad questions that I ask. And the question that I'm going to focus on today in my talk is that what are the characteristics of successful career documents? When I talk about career documents today, I'm going to talk about job descriptions, but we are very curious about how this impacts performance reviews, how it impacts other types of reviews, as well as CVs and things like that. And so that's sort of the broad context of what I do and where I'm coming from in terms of my biases. So I'm going to talk about 3 topics, and I'm hoping actually that this leaves a lot of room for Reese to come and talk about specifically interpretability algorithms. I'm going to focus a lot more on metrics. I'm going to talk about data, because I think that you can add whatever you want to your data, but if the underlying data is problematic, then we're just creating noise. And so that's sort of, again, my sort of interpretation of the world and my bias. Firstly, I'm going to talk about defining the right metrics and specifically how that's important in recruiting, but I want to sort of talk about that more broadly and what is the impact of picking the wrong metrics. Secondly, I'm going to talk about going beyond interpretability. So I think that there is a lot of work being done on trying to open up this black box algorithm, but I think it's really important as data scientists, as people who work with data, as HR professionals, we go beyond that and think about experiments, to go back to the scientific method a little bit and to really understand how we can make these decisions that we're making based on data robust. How do we think through that process? And then the last part of what I wanted to talk about is, and I think this is something that came up a lot in my classes, where when you know the context in which people make decisions, it's really helpful because you know how much to weight that data. Having an intuition for decision-making context is really critical. And that's a very short story that I think then I will lead into sort of the bias stack is what I wanted to get to. But first we'll start off with you are what you measure. And I wanted to talk about defining appropriate metrics. And this is sort of a nod to a lot of work that's been done in a lot of different industries. So in marketing tech, in sales, not so much in HR yet, but there's been a robust sort of experimentation that's been going on for the last 15, 20 years, right? And probably actually longer, but definitely on the online world, we're seeing these experiments play out more significantly. And these are sort of similar sort of metrics that you would use probably outside of the online world, but I think they've been defined really well in it. And there are basically 2 types of metrics that people think about. The first is things that are signposts. So they might not be the actual action, but they're very proximate to the action. So they're very easy to measure, they're cheap, they're lower level. So in the context of, e-commerce, for example, it's the idea of, you would add to a cart, this item to a cart. It signals that you're intending on potentially buying it, but it doesn't actually tell you that. North Star metrics, on the other hand, are things that are strategic. They're probably long-term, they're very valuable. They're many more steps away. but they're probably a better value for your organization to focus on. But they're very indirect. And so sometimes the relationship between when you need to get data out or what you need to do is very different between these two. So what I would highlight here is, the example is, and we can go back to the example of LinkedIn, but if we prioritize the wrong thing and put emphasis on the wrong metric, then you can create adverse incentives. And I think we all know this as people who work in the human capital industry. If you incentivize the wrong behavior, you can get bad outcomes. So it's really about deciding which one is more important and can you measure it. So there was for a long time, e-commerce is focused on things like adding to carts, but they didn't realize that people were adding to carts to keep them there for later view, and sometimes companies then created ways to flush your cart. And so that became a very useless or less effective mechanism of understanding what that is. Even though it was very proximate, it was really quick, you could figure that out. You could figure out all of the steps that it would take for you to get to someone to add something to their cart. But whether they purchase might have been a little bit longer, and it takes a lot longer, and you can't necessarily attribute which ad campaign they saw to the purchase. And I bring in the example of Netflix here, is that for a long time they used content views as their metric that they were using to train their models on. And so what I mean by that is that they were the label that they were attributing to their models was content views. And so they were trying to drive out content views and trying to figure out what features of these movies or of these processes were driving up content views. What that results in, and I think many of you know this from YouTube Gate and everything else that's been happening, is that you can focus on the wrong metric, you can create adverse incentives, you can make people fall down these weird loops, and it might not actually give you, it might not impact your bottom line. And so when Netflix actually changed to focusing on retention, so that a subscription retains for another year or whatever else, they found that that was a much more effective mechanism of being able to be stable for long-term growth. And so this is an important measurement. But when I think about recruiting, I take a step back and think about all of the different metrics that we have. And many of you and many of my students certainly have brought up all of the different metrics they deal with in their work. We have time to fill, which I mentioned earlier, which is nice and quick. It's not quick, but it's an easy thing to measure, and it's an easy thing to get a lot of measurements out of. There is success, which is a hard thing to measure because you have to go through a recruiting process, and then you need access to a company's internal data about whether that position was filled or not. And we have a bunch of other sort of signpost examples of the number of candidates, either the total or the percentage of qualified or interviewed, and you can fall down a rabbit hole of looking at each individual one. But today I'm going to focus primarily on time to fill and success and what our experiments looking at those two metrics was. So my question here was trying to understand what caused better, which one of what does this, like as in focusing on time to fill, if I trained a machine learning model and extracted all of the features of the jobs and was using a lower time to fill as a good positive sign, what does that tell me versus if I use success as that metric? And we did this with a couple of different examples. And so I'm going to show you here as we go along the junior tech jobs example. We matched dollar for dollar in terms of the level of seniority and the skill types, all of the boring stuff, but very important stuff, similar types of cities and similar growth and similar types of companies. What we did was we took all of those sorts of job descriptions, all of their features, and put it into a model and tried to figure out how can we predict a job's time to fill and which of these features is really important for that. And the first thing that we found was that the company was the most important feature of a time to fill. And as a company that helps other companies write job descriptions, I can't tell Netflix, oh, you should become Google. Like, that doesn't help them. They can't change who they are. So that's not a very helpful feature. And when we removed company and went to the next level of questions, what we saw was that it was billing, cost center that was really important for each company. So what this tells us is that the time to fill of a job is usually mediated by the internal processes of a company and of those cost centers too. When we look at success and this is not an easy metric to measure from an outside, but we have a lot of data so we can look at it from the inside. What we found was that job title was one of the strongest features to predict the success of a job. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what our job title experiments did. We took, again, another set of jobs, and this was separate to that first set. And these were jobs that were between 0 to 3 years of experience, so no more than 3 years. And these were, because I was presenting at a data science conference and data scientists love hearing about themselves, I looked at data science roles. And what we hypothesized was that a normal data science role gets a large applicant pool and a small number of qualified candidates. And when we add senior to the title, and this was one of the features that came out of this analysis, again, these are relatively junior roles. So adding senior overqualifies this role a little bit because senior data scientist roles are typically 5+ years, right? What we would expect is that you get a smaller candidate pool, but you get more qualified candidates. And this was sort of the overarching hypothesis that a lot of people in the field had. They were starting to overqualify these roles because they thought that they would get the better candidates from that large candidate pool. What we found was the opposite. Title inflation reduced the total number of candidates, but also reduced the number of qualified candidates. You weren't actually getting better candidates, you were getting sort of similar candidates. But the fundamental problem was that, you know, if you have to interview or phone screen like 8 candidates versus 4 candidates, your chance of success through this process is much lower for qualified candidates. So the overqualified role was resulting in a less successful process. And this was, you know, deeply problematic. And you could see that this impacted the time to fill and things like that. But the primary metric, the primary underlying thing was this issue of the title.
Maryam, a clarification from John. Can you define what success constitutes?
Yes, so someone was hired someone was given an offer for the position. So whether they accepted the offer, we didn't want to sort of analyze because there's a lot more that can go in that negotiation phase, but was someone successful in receiving an offer?
And then another comment from Eileen, stating maximum years of experience is discriminatory. So that there is an inherent bias that may link to age discrimination potentially.
So that is something that I think the UK has ruled on. We set as so anyone who said 3+ years of experience wouldn't make the cutoff if they required. So we set as a minimum, the goal of ours was to really figure out, if you're looking for an entry-level position in a hot talent market, like as is data science, you want to make sure that like we were trying to identify overqualified roles. And so years of experience was one mechanism of doing that. But there are other hints as well, like there's different skills that you can ask for that you typically ask for more senior roles than more junior roles. But title inflation is something that we found is actually really important in this process. And so we checked that these were relatively junior roles because, you know, it's very important to know that like the examples that we're using for our analysis are really true. So what's seen here is a big difference in terms of these 2 different roles based on just one word, the title. They asked for similar skills and qualifications. And we wondered whether this difference could be due to something like the confidence gap. And this is always in the back of my mind because I know that people often self-disqualify for roles when they look at them on job boards because they feel like they can't, you know, they're not meeting the basic bar. And just to remind everyone, the confidence gap is an idea that was very much popularized by Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook when she wrote her book on Lean In. But it was this idea that women only apply for jobs when they meet 100% of the qualifications and men will apply a little less discriminatingly. This idea hasn't really been proven in any scientific sort of method. This is based on very anecdotal data. But a lot of the recruiters that we talk to see this happening a lot. I think a lot of people sort of have, there's a reason why this has become a cultural moment. But so we wanted to understand whether this could be the reason why. And, you know, one of the ways in which we're looking at this is not just that women would be deterred from these jobs because they thought that, oh, I'm not a senior data scientist, but also a lot of people from different backgrounds. So we know that this actually goes beyond gender. Certainly people who are immigrants also feel this. And so you can imagine that the levels of race, gender, and ethnicity and things like that can interact on this idea. So was this the reason for this huge difference? So I'm gonna hit into our second story, which follows this. And it's this idea of going beyond interpretability. And I'm about to head into sort of experiments and hypotheses that we tested using data science. And by way of context, I've mentioned these, the way in which candidate behavior, we can measure at lots of different levels, but I'm only showing you here part of this situation. What we really see is the biggest part of this question is really the parts that I didn't mention earlier. It's things like search. It's whether a job is found or comes up in a candidate search, and then whether that job is clicked, and then whether the job is applied to, and you go through that process. And we had access to a lot of this information because we've been running a job search site for many years, and so we understood what are common terms that candidates search for, and if they are unearthed, what things do they click on versus not. And so one of the things that we knew from our analysis was that senior data scientist is not a common search term across the board. And this is an idea, this is because it's not very frequently searched for. People typically search for data scientist, not senior data scientist. It means that because senior data scientist has an extra word in it, it's not as highly surfaced up on searches for data science. And so what this results in is what we call a visibility gap, because it's not frequently searched for, and so it comes up lower on the gaps. And so we can look at number of clicks as a measure of that. And when we normalize for the number of candidates to the number of clicks, so now we're actually being like, okay, well, like let's say you got even numbers of visibility, what would be the difference? We can then identify what we think might be the confidence gap. So it's not nearly as dramatic as I showed you earlier, but it is there. So there's a combination of the two. So that's all well and good. What I haven't shown you is that this impacts women disproportionately. And what we see here is that both the proportion and the raw number of female applicants and qualified female applicants is much lower. And then the chance of a female hire in this case, or female offer, actually, I should correct that, follows through. So it's like that these jobs that are overqualified attract fewer women, and the rest of this process sort of goes on to show that they're not even attracting more qualified fewer women, they're sort of not attracting as strong candidate pools across the board. So when I talk about going beyond interpretability, I've shown you interpretable algorithms, but the real test of this, and I come from an experimental scientist background, is that how can we test this in a way that shows us the opposite is true? And so we did this experiment, but it was really experimental data science, is to understand, is to take the opposite and be like, okay, well, if this is actually due to a visibility gap, then a junior data scientist, which is also not a very common search term, should also have a visibility gap. And you can see here that it has a similar visibility gap to a senior data scientist role. And then if you do the opposite, if you think that there is, if the rest of that gap is due to the confidence gap, then underqualifying a role should increase the amount of applications when you normalize to the number of clicks. And what we see here is it actually does, and it was kind of amazing. It was almost to a similar level. So these jobs now, these junior data scientist jobs, when you add the word junior, they don't come up as high on search because people don't search for them. But when they do, they somehow manage to elicit more people to apply to them. And they have higher application rates, and they seem to be reasonably okay in terms of various other statistics as well. So this is sort of going beyond interpretability. It's really sort of, we're now in the realm of experimentation. So before I get into my last thing, I just wanted to let Stella ask any questions.
Nope.
Nope. So, so as someone who is now leading a filibuster, I'm going to sort of end with this last question of that recruiting is a conversation. And this is just me being a little bit cheeky. We see, and my job is to look at job descriptions all day. Everyone in our company does this all the time. And we see a lot of fascinating things. We could write books about it. But the thing that I think is most exciting is the one thing that I find really interesting is, when you have things written that are incredibly long. And these are jobs that, the founding documents of this country, the job descriptions feel like they should be longer than. And it's always shocking to me that we have these sorts of things, and they don't actually help search because typically that's most search algorithms sort of deal with the fact that you have a really long document. So it's not improving how easily they get unearthed. And this is an example of an actual job description. I've just changed I don't want to embarrass anyone, but this goes on and on and on. I think it's probably 1,500 words or something. And so this sort of highlights one thing that I wanted you all to take away is that, you know, behind this data there's a lot of other things. Like if we were to look at this job description just in terms of the data, we'd see like, oh, it's 1,500 words and it's got this and it's got that feature. But what this communicates in a way that we haven't been able to capture in all of our data, and these are the unknown unknowns, is that it communicates different things to different job seekers. It might communicate a very bureaucratic culture to some. It might communicate a dysfunctional team who can't put together priorities to others. And so there's a lot that goes on behind all of these documents, behind every data point that really speaks huge volumes in terms of processes that we don't necessarily always think of. And certainly in our experiments with people, we've seen that long ones can have this idea that they couldn't figure out what they were looking for and I'll never be able to meet it. And so this is just a very short sort of description that, you know, just like anything else, there is a distribution and there are sweet spots. So very long job descriptions don't necessarily attract more qualified candidates. In fact, they do the opposite. They attract fewer candidates, fewer qualified candidates. And these long job descriptions are generally typically much less likely to result in a hire. And there is also a short sweet spot, right? You can't put 10 words on a job description and hope that people will apply. It sort of is a balance between getting the right length and the right context in those. And these sweet spots vary depending on seniority and industry and a variety of other things. I'm sort of just giving you the broad strokes here. So to sort of step back and think about the 3 topics that I wanted to talk about today about responsibly using algorithms. One, I sort of highlighted the example and the importance of measuring and defining effective metrics. We defined success in this case, and what we found was, unsurprisingly, title inflation decreased success, but it also decreased the signal of that. So when focusing on success, we found that there was, we found the issue of title inflation, and that sort of played out in its own way in terms of increasing the number of qualified candidates, and signal to noise is a common sort of idea that's used in signal processing. Secondly was, you know, I didn't talk about explainable algorithms a lot today, or interpretable algorithms, because I think it's really important to go beyond whatever your model is, to really test hypotheses with your data, to have a subset that you leave aside. And that allows you to really understand insights that can go in towards questions that fundamentally understand that behavior, and we've seen that robustly. So seeing something that gives me a p-value of less than 0.05 is important, but being able to show that robustly in multiple times in lots of different contexts is something that I can believe in, and I think it's really important in data science that we start dealing with that question beyond just having a p-value cutoff and being like, okay, let's send it up to production. And lastly, and this is me coming at this from a idea of really sort of understanding what goes behind that data and how that creates outcomes, how people are responding to those questions, and why are they responding in certain ways. And I think that's really critical to understanding the way in which people operate and the decisions that have made it into their data where they act. So, you know, we talk a lot, sorry about this, we talk a lot about algorithmic biases, and I think Reese will talk a lot next week about, you know, or in a couple of weeks about, you know, interpretability mechanisms. But I think what underlies an algorithmic bias is, you know, bad metrics. And so deciding which feature to focus on in terms of your model is really critical. And picking features that are brittle. And I'll talk a little bit more about brittleness in a slide. The second is in terms of data biases. And we know that poor data, so the Amazon example is a perfect example of when you had very bad and biased training data where only men were hired, or a large proportion of men were hired, that can have dramatic outcomes in terms of data biases. They go on and flow. The algorithm is just to soak up whatever biases are in the data. But the last part that I want to highlight to you all, and especially as people who think about what is going on behind those data points, especially as people who are in an industry where you're deciding things based on human behavior, it's really important to think about the processes. So how were those decisions made? How were they comfortable? Were they uncomfortable? You know, like, why did we make certain types of decisions? Like, do we privilege certain sources? Why do we privilege certain sources? For example, referrals in companies, or like, what is the context in which someone decided to evaluate resumes, and did causing cognitive overload cause them to make decisions that are based on bad decisions? And how can we improve those questions? How can we create better training data for our algorithms? And really it's about understanding that decision context. So to sort of summarize and end up, I started off with this example of Amazon and AI in recruiting. And as you can imagine, as we sort of expand further, I love this example of a tweet by Robin Spear, who's a very prominent natural language processing researcher, which goes on to sort of really take the question of, how we can take these systems and then we decide to go and deploy them in other areas that are similarly high stakes, similarly important. And we're seeing the growth of these algorithms in lots of different areas. It's not just the companies that are, it's not just big tech that's implementing them. We have a lot of vendors in the space that address these questions. And I think especially in the context of COVID and in the context of this unusually changing time and processes, a couple of things that I'd highlight. In terms of those of you who are also teachers, in terms of ed tech, we're seeing a lot of surveillance mechanisms coming out in terms of monitoring student behavior and their attention span during talks. We're seeing surveillance mechanisms being used to identify people who aren't wearing masks from a public policy perspective, but that has important privacy considerations. And I think we're seeing the use of, and this is an example of a case where software is being used to track productivity. And I know that that's definitely something that's become top of mind, certainly from a lot of vendors are talking about how the view of that has changed. And so there's not all doom and gloom. What I would say, and I sort of, Stella and I were talking about this before everyone came, was that, the other thing to consider in all of this is that we're suddenly behaving in ways that no one ever expected us to behave. And they didn't build systems for this. And so the algorithms that we use to train our recommendation systems were not trained for us in a pandemic time. They were trained for us in the time that we would do certain other things. And so this is going to disrupt a lot of different algorithms. It's going to disrupt a lot of your recommendation systems, but it's also going to disrupt how you work. And so it's not all that they can figure out everything that we want to do. From a data science perspective, I would highly recommend starting to make sure the fact that you're collecting data right now in a COVID era. So whether that's from a retention process or whether that's from a performance management, it's really important that gets taken into account because you can't compare these two eras at all. And so it's going to break a lot of systems. And I think that's interesting from a data science perspective of how you manage those changes in behavior. So to end up, I highlight a couple of examples. I've put examples throughout this talk of books and reports that I think are really important and critical reading. I read a lot about the way in which we profile people outside of recruiting, obviously, because I think it's important to read around the systems that are being developed in these. And so with that, I just wanted to thank you all. We are fundamentally the sum of all of our decisions, whether those are intentional or unintentional. It's really important to think about that broader context and to think about that in the context of all of our data and the work that we do. So thank you, Stella. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And we have a few questions to follow on if we can go there. So from Adrian again. In your experience, can bias be probabilistically modeled? So for example, singular components versus feedback loop as part of the training pipeline, capturing bias as a negative rewards and reinforcement learning.
So reinforcement learning and definitely adversarial circumstances can reduce bias infiltration. It just takes a lot of data and you need to have measured it effectively. So it can be done, but it's very difficult work and you sort of need to train, you have to train your model or your agents to really go against it, but it's not a trivial process. And so we don't invest that much time in that. There are other ways of doing it. I mean, part of the thing is that, yeah, it's a broader question and I know I'm getting way too specific. So I'm happy to talk about it later as well.
By the way, we have a Slack channel and you can join and find Maryam to ask her directly some of these questions too. There's one other from Beverly. I also see company-specific abbreviation terminology in a lot of job descriptions. Do you see any negative effect of those?
Yeah, we do. We've actually been trying to, it's very difficult, especially when it's in titles, it doesn't come up on search very easily. And so we guide against that. We try and remove jargon as well because we found that jargon really does deter people, even if they're qualified for roles, to not apply because they think, I don't think it's that they don't understand what the jargon is. And the idea is that, you create these thresholds and these bars, right, for people. So you're like, oh, I'm going to give you the senior data scientist so you can get deterred, like the bad the bad people will get deterred, and we actually don't ever see that the bad people get deterred. They have a lot less, I guess, self-awareness, and so the good people tend to get deterred. And so that's another example of a type of barrier that people put, that they're like, oh, they should know this jargon, it should be very clear to them. But I think what happens is that people see that jargon and they're like, oh, this seems like a really like stuffy environment or whatever else, I don't think I'd fit in there, or they won't like someone like me. You know, there's a lot of sort of prototype matching that goes on behind that, which I think is interesting. So I would caution people from using things that are way too specific, or to their specific area that, you know, isn't something that's industry jargon. Like there are some things like, you know, the technologies that you use, or the areas that you're sort of familiar with, you know, frameworks that you're using are really important to put in there. And it shows some depth, but I think in club jargon can just create barriers, and it's not an ideal system.